So, dear friends, I wish you very welcome and happy to see so many of you here in spite of the surprise return of winter. And we have a somewhat chaotic situation in the traffic, so I think there will be some latecomers coming in, and that is something which we just have to accept. But I wish you very welcome to the 2023 Claes-Göran Alfstam Seminar on International Trade. And this is the first in a series of recurring seminars in honor of the late professor in economic geography, Claes-Göran Alfstam. For almost half a century, he was active at the School of Business, Economics and Law, making an impact on generations of students and fostering successful research environments in the field of international business and trade, and also in the initiating of the Center for European Research at the Göteborgs University. The theme of today's seminar is very closely related to the core of Claes-Göran's academic interests. The structures setting the conditions for international trade and economic interaction. And during the last decade, we have witnessed rapid changes in these conditions, deviating from the ethos of liberalizing international trade with the objective to further community welfare, but also to increase interdependence between states, thereby furthering international stability. This ethos was dominant already at the Bretton Woods negotiations. It was recalled in the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947. It was strengthened and geographically expanded during the 1990s through the end of the bipolar power balance of the Cold War and the establishment of the WTO as a global normative code for international trade. This was a period in history which made the philosopher Francis Fukuyama to declare that we had reached the end of history through the victory of a liberal democracy and regulated market economy. The complex development we witness today is moving in an opposite direction, and the journal The Economist has declared the return of history. We witness a successive erosion of the normativity of the multilateral structures for regulating international trade. This is a process which actually is consciously brought about by major actors. It's combined with an increasing use of protectionist measures and the development of new formats of regional cooperation, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and the creation of the RCEP and the CPTPP in the Pacific Basin, overlapping preferential areas. Moreover, the lessons from COVID and increased geopolitical tensions make countries and businesses change their models and supply chains. And during the last year, these developments have been aggravated by the repercussions of an illegal, large-scale, aggressive war in Europe. Taken together, this has led to incentives for governments, as well as for commercial actors to put forward initiatives for friend sourcing rather than outsourcing, in order to secure value chains and strategic autonomy. Finally, we can note that these interconnected developments are taking place in a time when the world is facing existential common challenges, like climate change, depletion of biodiversity, challenges that actually warrant effective multilateralism. So it's easy to be dystopic, and it's certainly a precarious and unforeseeable process of change that we are in the midst of. And in order to be able to navigate into the future, we need to understand this process as well as its possible solutions. And therefore, in order to gain this deeper understanding of the changing conditions for international trade, transboundary economic interactions, we have invited 3 very qualified and knowledgeable speakers for the seminars today. We have Cecilia Malmström, former European Commissioner for Trade, member of the European Parliament and Minister of European Affairs, at present non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Anders Ahnlid, Director of the National Board of Trade in Stockholm, and Petros Mavroidis, who has the Edwin B. Parker Professorial Chair of Foreign and Comparative Law at Columbia University, New York City. The 3 speakers will make introductory presentations of about 20 minutes each. There will be room for short and direct questions if there needs to be any clarifications. Then we take a coffee break. And after the coffee break, we'll have a good hour for discussions, monitored by me and Patrik Ström. We will have microphones available for you here that participate from the lecture hall, and for you that participate at a distance, please use the Zoom chat function, and we'll let you into the discussion. With that said, I leave the floor to our first speaker, Cecilia Malmström. Please.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Per. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Eva, it gives me a great pride to be here today to commemorate a friend, a colleague, a great scholar, and an appreciated professor and teacher. Claes would certainly have so much to say about the current situation, and I do miss our conversations. I hope that his spirit, his analytical skills, his curiosity will serve us all as a guide on how to approach real and academic challenges of the world today. Deglobalization, slowbalization, homeshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, decoupling, Buy America, strategic autonomy, made in Europe, fragmentation. The trade dictionary has certainly expanded with a lot of new words this last years. And they all imply that we are undergoing profound changes, that globalization has peaked, and that we must focus on ourselves and maybe our friends. That free trade hasn't really worked. So better produce locally and hope for the best. Is that true? And if it is that a good development? I will use some minutes of your attention to reflect on these complexities. Let me first start by saying that trade has served the world well during the pandemic. Yes, there were initial hiccups and there were certain shortages, but overall we could buy vaccines, medical supplies, equipment, commodities in the shop and online. The recovery last year, before the war, was faster than predicted. Supply chains proved to be rather resilient, and we even saw some minor but important progress at the ministerial meeting at the last WTO conference in June. There are also no immediate signs that global trade is unraveling from Europe and to the US, or reshoring, bringing trade back home from China. They are rather looking for additional supplies in Asia, mainly, but also in Mexico, for instance, in the American case, and thereby diversifying. Since the creation of GATT 75 years ago, that Per alluded to, followed by the WTO, we have seen an amazing economic growth and in human well-being. Global GDP today is 10 times higher than after the Second World War. Millions and millions have been lifted out of poverty thanks to global trade and economic cooperation. Human life expectancy has increased with 62% since the end of the war. and GATT, and later the WTO, have been instrumental in creating rules and standards to open global markets and setting up common rules. But now this is changing. We have new challenges, and it is fair to say that globalization is not dead, but it certainly undergoes deep changes. And there are many uncertainties. The golden years after the 1990s, we saw a huge surge in quick, efficient supply chains that linked business networks and transport in a new way, facilitated by the digital transformation, a wave of trade liberalization, and that was also, hopefully not the peak, but it was high time for democracies to flourish after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Those times are hopefully not over, but they're certainly not here today. Trade is also said to have peaked around 2008, 2009, and declined ever since. That is true to a certain extent, but it's not a dramatic change. And furthermore, trade in services is growing dramatically. And we've seen that during COVID, of course. So we are what some scholars say a perma-crisis or a polycrisis, another word to add to your dictionary. That was actually the word of the year in Oxford Dictionary last year. And that, of course, includes Russia's war on Ukraine, the high energy prices, the post-COVID challenges, weak international organizations, the erosion of democracy. There are fewer democracies today than 25 years ago, unfortunately. The growth of populism. So there is certainly a gloomy time right now. We also see increased intervention of states, a kind of revival of industrial policies, and a trade pattern that focuses on security rather than efficiency. Just in time has become just in case. And this has resulted in an increased politicization of trade. Companies need to take geopolitical considerations. And this is due to many things, such as the changing policies of the US, starting under the Trump era. President Trump, if you recall, he saw trade as a bad thing, and trade wars are good and easy to win. He used trade to put political pressure. In Mexico, in relation to the migration issue, in the EU, along with many allies to the US, he introduced tariffs on steel and aluminium based on a notion of national security. So importing steel from Sweden and elsewhere was a threat to national security, according to President Trump. He also threatened with similar action on car, and this was, of course, all due to domestic policies and motivated by that. He also imposed a lot of tariffs and export controls on China to punish them for not behaving in the WTO, but also in general. And this policy, unfortunately, has not changed during the Biden administration. President Biden, when he was candidate, he criticized this policy a lot, but unfortunately, it is still there. Lately, the US have been scaling up tariffs vis-à-vis China and introducing new export controls for security reasons, but also for fear of too much competition. We have seen that, especially for semiconductors, and the US is pushing the world to follow suit. Japan has said that they agree, and apparently also the Netherlands. So the US has become increasingly protectionist, reinforcing Buy America and Buy American, the Jones Act, refusing to engage in trade agreements and not following WTO rulings, neither engaging in reforming the organization. Just before Christmas, the WTO actually came out with a ruling and saying that the tariffs you imposed on steel and aluminium based on the motivation of national security are not in compliance with WTO rules. The US shrugged. The US does not want to enter in trade agreements if they address market access or trade liberalization. They more want to talk about supply chains and security, and pushing allies to be tough on China, but not really giving anything back for them when it comes to market access, for instance. And Secretary Yellen, the finance minister of the US, has introduced the concept of friend-shoring, which means roughly that you only trade with countries where you can totally secure all the parts of the supply and value chains. But what is a friend, and who is a friend? And if you're not a friend, are you then a foe? And lots of countries in the world feel like, okay, are we on the list? And the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act has certainly led to criticism from a lot of friends in the EU, Japan, South Korea, the UK, etc. I'll come back to that. So this is something that has changed trade dramatically. Then, of course, we have the pandemic. Suddenly, millions of people were sick, ill, or in lockdown. Factories closed, ports did not function, supply chains were interrupted. Transport and logistics were, of course, severely affected. But business became surprisingly flexible. And overall, as I said in my introduction, it worked. We saw a diversification, a flexibility, and a resilience. Still, some dependencies have become obvious. So there has been a massive investment in batteries, semiconductors, rare earth metals, and minerals. This was already happening before the war. It has been accentuated, of course, by the war and the cruel and illegal invasion by Russia on Ukraine. It has led to enormous humanitarian suffering and terrible war crimes. And it is likely to go on for quite some time. This is, of course, an attack on Ukraine, on its people, on its identity, on its territory. But it is also a threat to the whole European security, and therefore Ukraine must win this war. The European Union, the UK, US, Canada, and a lot of allies have been quick in agreeing on sanctions against Russia in all areas, the most ambitious sanctions in history. The aim is, of course, to isolate Russia economically, politically, but also make it a pariah when it comes to cultural, scientific, and social cooperation. More than 1,500 companies have left Russia. And this has, of course, led to distortion in trade. We have seen that we were dependent on some commodities from these countries. It has led to inflation and high energy prices, and we have seen the effect it has on corn and on some agricultural exports. Europe has struggled, or some countries in Europe have struggled to reduce its dependence on gas from Russia, because we saw already before the war how Russia is using gas as a weapon. This process has gone quicker than predicted for now, but with the winter maybe coming back, that might change. For now, the gas reserves are rather full due to the so far mild winter and a targeted effort in Europe to find new trading partners and switching towards more fossil-free energy sources. It has also led to an increase in green energy investment and is speeding up the green transition. Donald Duck has a question. Is he in the chat? But the Russian dependency and seeing how it can be weaponized has also made us realize that we're also extremely dependent on something else, rare earth metals. Rare earth metals and minerals, you remember them from your physics lessons, lithium, copper, platina, nickel. They are the new global currency. It's not dollar, it's not gold, it's not even cryptocurrency. This is the new currency. And we desperately need them. The dependence of us in the West on these metals will increase with 500% the coming 2 decades. They are in batteries, in semiconductors, in all your computers and telephones that you have there, and they're crucial in the green transition. We need them in wind turbines, in electric vehicles, etc. And China controls 85% of global processing and refining capacity. The world will soon become more dependent on lithium and other metals than we were on gas and oil. And this is, of course, a cause of concern, and countries are now looking at new critical raw material strategies. The aim is to facilitate resilient and diverse supply chains with high standards when it comes to social and other environmental standards. There seems to be quite a lot of those metals around the world. In Sweden, there are quite a lot, apparently, down earth. In the deep grounds of Sweden, but here and elsewhere you need permissions, you need evaluation, you need environmental impacts, licenses, assessment, and considerations to the indigenous population. So it will take time, but it is there. EU and US tensions have unfortunately grown lately due to another of these acronyms, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The transatlantic relationship has become very solid when it comes to support for Ukraine and sanctions vis-à-vis Russia. There is a daily coordination on how that works, how to expend, how to monitor them, and how to support Ukraine, and discussions also how to support the reconstruction of Ukraine. But this act, which is an act to reduce inflation, but moreover it's a super ambitious package to support investment in green energy and in green infrastructure and technology. It's the most ambitious ever we've seen in the US, and it should be welcomed. This is very good for the US and for the world. But it has discriminatory elements in it vis-à-vis Europe and other parts. And it is, in all likelihood, not WTO compatible in this regard. On cars, for instance, American citizens can get tax rebates if they buy an electric vehicles, but it has to be made in the US, assembled in the US, with US components. That is not WTO compatible. There are also possibilities for tax reliefs and subsidies for companies investing in green technology in the US, also for European and other companies, which is of course something that many companies welcome, but that combined with much cheaper energy in the US also lead to discussion that we might move our investments, our big green investments, to the US rather than Europe or the UK, South Korea, Japan. They have similar concerns. And this is, of course, something that is creating tension, has led to a lot of discussions in the EU. Discussions, should EU do the same thing? Should we have a Buy Europe or a Made in Europe strategy? We'll talk more about this. I think Anders will come back to that as well. But this is, of course, something you have to handle with enormous care, because we talk about a lot of money that has to be mobilized from somewhere. And we also talk about relaxing state aid rules. They are rather rigid in the EU, and we have relaxed them during COVID. And relaxing them further, what effect will that have on the internal market and the competition between small countries who cannot invest and big countries like Germany and France, who are 80% of the state aid allowances from the EU. But we'll come back to that probably in the discussion as well. But there is a trend for a revival of industrial policies. Countries all over the world is subsidizing. China, of course, has been doing that for a very long time. Now the US, the EU are investing billions of dollars and euros in semiconductors, hydrogen, batteries. We see the same development in Australia, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Canada. And this risks, of course, a global spiral of subsidies. And we don't have sufficient global rules on this. The WTO is weak, is in a position where it has not been able to enforce disciplines on this. So when the US is becoming more inward-looking and protectionist, there's also a risk that the EU goes the same way, with more trade restrictive instruments and some protectionist elements as well. If you look at them one by one, they make perfectly sense. It's about having investment screening, it's about anti-coercion, it's about due diligence and forced labor protection, and they all make sense. But if you put them together and do not balance them with also open markets, this risk to tip to the wrong side. This is done, of course, to create a fairer level playing field, and also addressing issues such as climate and labor, which is important. And that has been the case in trade relations for quite some time, that you cannot just trade. Free trade is actually not free trade. Free trade is very regulated, liberalized trade. The trade agreement between EU and Canada is 1,500 pages. Excellent reading for a Friday night. It's online, it's in Swedish, you can get it. And then we can talk about it on Monday. I have a few questions for you then. But this is, of course, because we have to regulate how the free trade should be regulated. And it contains a lot of paragraphs also on sustainable trade related to international conventions, on environment, on labor, on human rights, etc. And this is a trend we see all over the world. So trade is not there only by itself, it is also made to be much fairer. And increasingly, companies are living up to those pressures by citizens, by consumer groups, by trade unions, etc. So Trade has changed a lot. It is hard to see exactly when this development will turn. Trade will continue to be a very powerful tool to lift people out of poverty. It will play a role in the recovery after COVID, and we need to make sure that it continues and that it is regulated by global rules. There will be some regionalizing, there will be some home shoring of certain sensitive products, medical equipment, some of these raw materials, etc. And there is definitely a need to diversify even more. Diversification makes the whole world stronger. And we cannot be entirely dependent on these key metals from China. And what if China invades Taiwan? Taiwan produces most of the semiconductors in the world right now. Every company that I've met have a plan B for what if China invades Taiwan. So we have to have a scenario for that. But if you look at the statistics, and Klaus loved to look at trade statistics, cross-border investment is still growing. Global value chains are so complex and beneficial, so it would be complicated to dismantle them and to bring production home. And with a few exceptions, reshoring will be very expensive. And that will be for consumers, and it also risks to undermine innovation. And for the non-vulnerable goods, like 95% of trade, it is important not to build up protectionist barriers. Because the cost of giving up global trade is immense and will affect the developing countries most, if they're not on the friend list. Export is a fantastic means of growth, and the future of friend shoring, if it divides the world in basically two parts, we've seen that before in history, that, according to the WTO, will cost the world 5% of global GDP on average, which means maybe 3 or 4 here, but 25 in Africa. So this is something we need to keep in mind. And a closed trading system will also not be good for climate cooperation, for health cooperation, and for the spread of innovative ideas that we need to do here. So what do we need to do? 90% of global growth is happening outside the EU. So the EU truly needs to become more competitive. So it needs to continue with open trade. The trade agreements that are there need to be cherished. We need to ratify trade agreements that already exist but haven't entered into force yet. We need to engage with other parts of the world as well. The Asia-Pacific is a very dynamic area. Per, you listed a whole bunch of acronyms from there, showing that this is a part of the world where the death of globalization is not a subject they talk about. I was in Singapore just before Christmas, and they didn't understand the question. Well, they did, but they say it's not really relevant for us because there has been a numerous growth of bilateral, regional, and plurilateral trade agreements there to facilitate. There's also very interesting things happening in Africa. The Africa Free Trade African Continent Free Trade Agreement is something that African countries have concluded. It is a slow process, but it is moving. And of course, if Africa could be a free trade area, that would increase trade and growth and well-being immensely. So we need to support that development to help to build the stepping stones of this at their conditions, of course. Free trade agreements are tools to trade, but they're also tools to create partnerships. And you can see that trade agreements lead to cooperation far beyond the pure trade area. And this is something we need to continue. We also need to continue talking with the US, of course, try to find a way out of this IRA, which is not to be confused with Irish Republican Army, just be clear. A bit strange to choose that acronym, actually. So to find a way to mitigate the negative effects on this, because it will have a lot of positive effects as well. The EU and the US created 2.5 years ago a Trade and Tech Council with lots of working groups. It's not a trade agreement, but it's a fora to discuss in issues related to trade. Standards, semiconductors, WTO, artificial intelligence, the security of supply chains, etc. It is a good fora, but it has been underperforming so far. So it needs more teeth to see what you can really do to facilitate trade on standards, on green growth, on digital, on how to reform the WTO. The cooperation as I said, on Ukraine has been excellent, but we need to go beyond that. We need to continue trading with China. Yes, there are immense problems in China with forced labor, with violation of human rights, with a non-functional rule of law system. But we do need to engage with China on environment and climate issues and on the reform of international organizations such as WTO. China has promised to do some changes. That has not happened. There are massive subsidies, there are state-owned enterprises, there are discriminatory conditions for Western companies there, but we still need to engage with them while being aware that investment for them is very much geopolitical, very much comes with a bill, so to say. And China has also increased its protectionism, and it wants to be self-sufficient in a lot of areas. Let's see now what happens in China when they have moved from zero COVID to maximum COVID, opening again, which is of course good for global trade. There are scholars claiming that China has possibly peaked. I'm not an expert enough to say whether that is true or not, but let's look at China's development. They will also increase a lot global demand for energy now that China is opening up as well, and this will affect prices. WTO needs to be strengthened and reformed. I think Petros will talk more about that. It has flaws, of course, but it is the organization that exists. It still functions. It's not optimal, but there is a lot to do there. And the alternative is, of course, the rule of the jungle. And that is only good for the big players. And that is also a fora where we need to discuss trade and climate, which is the #1 issue coming up here. EU also, furthermore, and I'll end with this, needs to reform its internal market. This year is not only the 100th anniversary of Handelshögskolan, it's also the 30 years anniversary of the internal market in the EU. It's a diamond in many ways, and many countries look at it with envy. But it still has a lot of work to do before it really becomes a free internal market. There are a whole list of issues such as standards, licenses, public procurement, interoperability issues that could facilitate and increase trade, also when in the digital and in the AI sector. This will create a lot of new jobs and a lot of growth. So to sum up, trade was never thought to solve all problems. It has created jobs for millions of people, lifted millions of people out of poverty. It has opened new areas of cooperation, and it will be key for the post-COVID recovery. But of course, it needs to be combined with a lot of other policies to make sure that the benefits of trade trickles down to every individual. But this is more related to tax policy and social policy and distribution policy. I would say that the rumors about the death of globalization are largely exaggerated. They were able to come up with global vaccines in record time, thanks to global cooperation. Never before could we have vaccines developed in and there were global cooperation among scientists all over the world in order to achieve this. We must build on that experience. We must revive international governance, strengthen multilateralism where that is possible, or at least with as vast a circle of friends as possible. Defend open trade when it is possible, invest in, as I said, the infrastructure so that it trickles down to the citizens, and increase cooperation on the big, really important things: climate change, health issues, peace, and reconstruction of Ukraine. So it would be very dangerous to throw out the baby with the bathing water. Globalization is still a good thing, but it has changed. And hopefully, when we come out of this period right now, it will be more responsible, more transparent, more sustainable, and have better global governance as well. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I would just like to tell those that participate in the Zoom room that initially I have gathered that the sound was not coming through. And just as a piece of information, when we have a discussion after the recess, you will be welcome to participate in the discussion from the Zoom room through the chat. Are there any direct questions to Cecilia here and now? Yes.
About the conditions in China, is there any about the conditions in China for exchange with Europe? Is there any possibilities for future conditions for relations to Europe?
Well, Europe is cooperating with China in a lot of areas. There's a lot of trade going on already, and it has worked. Some of it diminished during COVID, but there is still a lot of trade, and I think that will continue. The question is, of course, sort of normal trade, but the sensitive, vulnerable trade related mainly to rare earth metals. There will be a change, but it will take time because you don't get copper out of a mine in a weekend, and there will be some other movements more probably in the greater area of Asia. And there is already a cooperation between the US and EU, but also with many other Western allies to put greater pressure on China when it comes to forced labor in the Xinjiang region, where atrocities are committed against the Uyghur population. There is a growing sort of not global alliance, but at least a big group of and this will of course affect, because we trade quite a lot with that region. But for normal, I think that will continue. The EU will publish a trade agreement on China, a strategy on China. It has been delayed, but it will probably come later this fall, this spring. Spring it is, yeah. Or winter.
Thank you.
We can come back to the whole China issue, because
exactly.
we have lots of expertise among my co-panelists.
So thank you, Cecilia, and I will ask Anders Arnlid to take the floor. Please, Anders.
Thank you very much, Per. And I have some slides here that I would maybe seek to... No, there. Thank you so much, Per, and thank you so much for the invitation to take part in today's Claes-Göran Alstam seminar. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be able to do so and be invited to do so. Much has already been said about Claes-Göran's important contribution both to academia and to our society at large. And I would just like to underline that also from my perspective. I have spent some 35 years plus in Swedish trade policy making in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a civil servant. And Claes' writings, his students, his PhD students, including Lena Lindberg, who is here today, who has joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All this has meant a lot to the way Sweden has approached trade policy making, in particular to Asia and Southeast Asia. An important, very important contribution from Claes-Göran. As I said, I've been doing trade policy for quite some time. I'm a veteran from the Uruguay round negotiations that launched the World Trade Organization back in the 1990s. The glory days, the heydays of globalization, as Cecilia mentioned. But before I start talking about this world that Cecilia outlined from the perspective of our European Union, I would just like to say a few words about the National Board of Trade, Kommerskollegium, that I have the privilege of heading since 2.5 years back. Kommerskollegium, the National Board of Trade, is Sweden's government agency for international trade, EU trade policy, and EU internal market and trade policy. I would like to congratulate the Göteborgs School of Business, Economics and Law to its 100 years anniversary. Kommerskollegium this year turns 373 years. We were founded in 1651 in what was then pre-war years. One of our first tasks back then was to engage in negotiations with Great Britain on a Swedish-Great Britain trade and navigation agreement that came into force a few years later. So there is nothing much new under the sun. Our vision in the National Board of Trade is sustainable trade without barriers, and We, as I said, work on 3 pillars. We want to make sure that the EU internal market is functioning as well as possible and delivers sustainable solutions. Cecilia has already alluded to the difficulties we have. I'll come back to that briefly. We do the same for the global trading system, the WTO, the trade agreements that the EU enters into, and we are also engaged in, for us, quite an important and substantial activity in relation to developing countries and development assistance. But coming back now to the outlook from our European Union to this grim world that we are presently in the middle of due to the outrageous war in Ukraine and how the world changed after the 24th of February last year. Cecilia has already drawn up the picture in a very good way. For the European Union, of course, this new reality and the I can't say that word, the way security policy has affected trade policy already started before the war, of course. The pandemic, as Cecilia said, showed that there is a need for companies, for governments to rethink maybe some of their strategies, but not all. And as Cecilia mentioned, the pandemic also was largely we made it through the pandemic thanks to the global trading system and the EU internal market. Russia's war already underlined this new way of handling the need to think about trade policy in a new way even further. And this has had, no doubt, profound consequences, both for our policy relating to the EU internal market and to EU's external trade policy. And as Cecilia mentioned, we are going in the wrong direction presently, basically overall. More protectionism, more barriers, less openness. That's the kind of direction, unfortunately, at the moment. And for the EU, we have had, as you know, a debate on how to handle this situation. And we have had quest for more strategic autonomy, as it were. And those of us, as Sweden, that want to see openness have added that we should not talk about strategic economy, we should talk about open strategic economy. I normally present reports from the National Board of Trade, but I would like to draw attention today to a report that was issued very recently by the European Centre for International Political Economy, ESIP, in Brussels, a think tank in Brussels. They have mandated a study on trying to measure the costs of strategic strategic autonomy in the European Union. And they have done so by gathering a number of measures. Cecilia mentioned many of them that have recently been taken in order to achieve this objective, and then quantify through a economic computable I always forget what they are called, these models. Computable general equilibrium model, is that correct? Trying to calculate the costs of what we are doing. And they have looked at 4 types of measures. Measures taken for industrial policy purposes, measures taken for the purpose of correcting for market failures in the EU, measures taken for correcting for market failures outside the EU, and then measures taken in response to measures taken by other countries. And they have come up with figures when they put all this into the model that the cost of this in a static model would be around 0.1 to 0.15% of European gross domestic product. Not much. It's about the same as how much we gain from a good free trade agreement in a static model. But taking dynamic effects into account, these costs would be much higher. And I'm sure that that would be the consequence that we see in the economy. So 3 to 5 times higher than what this model is giving us as a result would probably be the cost for this strategic autonomy that we are now engaging upon. And as Cecilia also alluded to, smaller member states are losing more than larger. And it is, in this case, our EU policy that is inflicting these costs on us, not the doings of others. And the question here is, of course, if this is a sufficiently well-defined insurance policy that is worth this price. And that question, I think, still needs to be answered. It's evident that we need a security approach. We need an insurance policy. The question is of what sort. Cecilia talked about the EU internal market, and we have challenges here as well. It is evident. We see it's compartmentalized in too large an extent. Previous years, including when Cecilia was commissioner, there was always a overall internal market strategy presented by the European Commission. Not any longer. Now the internal market is looked at in different ecosystems, and there are a lot of private-public partnership initiatives taken in order to advance the market from the perspective of the present internal market Commissioner Breton, who is to a large extent viewing Europe as French ministers view France, and tries to pursue the same kind of policies on Europe that have not been very successful over the years in France. But we can come back to that maybe. So the situation we have, the multiple crises, the perceived rivalry with the US and China, as Cecilia alluded to, have led to large number of new legislative initiatives in our European Union, and has led to frantic activity, creating new laws and regulations that we now will see the consequence of. No overarching single market strategy. Might be costly in the long run. And several inward-looking initiatives, as Cecilia mentioned, including on raw materials, semiconductors, and what have you. And Cecilia also mentioned that we are relaxing the state aid regime, which has been rigid, I would say, in Europe over the years, at least more rigid in Europe than elsewhere. And we are now risking of destroying that, and that will be costly, no doubt. But for the EU, of course, the global situation is also very worrying. And I will not repeat the good recipes that Cecilia already has mentioned that the EU should follow on the global level. But I think it's important to point out that presently there is only one large defender of the global trading system, and that is the European Union. And that responsibility is very important for our European Union to continue to uphold. Well, yes, Japan is also there. That's good. And there are a number of other friends, but none large enough to really steer and to give direction to the system. And absent, as long as the US is absent, of course, this is a very tall order for the European Commission that is doing this for us, member states. But I think so far the EU has done a good job in trying to move the system forward. It was the European Union that was the main creator, I would argue, for the fairly successful outcome of the ministerial meeting that Cecilia mentioned that took place in the WTO in June last year. The EU will have to continue to work with India and South Africa that are causing a lot of difficulties in the World Trade Organization of various sorts, which we can also come back to if there is an interest. And of course, as Cecilia has already been talking about, the cooperation with the United States is crucial for the European Union. And it is really troublesome the way in which the United States is not seeing advantages of mending the global trading system as is presently the case, departing from what the United States did so well after the Second World War in creating the GATT and the WTO that followed, and the dangers in now again abandoning this system. One shouldn't draw too much on historical analogies, but it is a fact that in between the First and Second World War, of course, we saw protectionism. We saw the American draconian Smoot-Hawley tariffs that basically contributed to the depression and what followed. We mustn't make similar mistakes in these dire straits that we are presently in. Cecilia also talked about the importance of the new body for EU-US cooperation, the Trade and Technology Council, which will meet during the Swedish presidency in Luleå towards the end of the Swedish presidency half year. Finally, some challenges posed to Sweden as holding the presidency of the EU Ministerial Council. You might recall, some of you, the fact that we've had two EU presidencies already in 2001 and 2009. These are the ties that were then seen as the kind of hallmark of the Swedish presidency. This time there is not yet a Swedish presidency tie, but the government that entered Rosenbad in the autumn has decided, in comparison to the former government that abandoned the tie habit, that there will be a Swedish presidency tie coming even now, for what it's worth. Make Europe greener, safer, freer. That is the motto of the Swedish presidency. And of course, Ukraine is the priority number one. Support for Ukraine through the means that Cecilia mentioned, continued upholding of the sanctions against Russia, fiscal support, military support, and what have you, but also support when it comes to integrating Ukraine in the EU internal market and in the other structures of our European Union in preparation for membership. And as you know, Ukraine was given membership status half a year ago, or a bit more, to the European Union, which is a very important step. Important for the Swedish presidency is also to contribute to increased competitiveness of our European Union. It is a fact that Europe has lagged behind in the game of competitiveness, globally speaking, and that has to change. Given the circumstances and given the evolution of the EU internal market, it's a tall order, of course. And there aren't many measures that are taken in Brussels presently that clearly gives the European Union a competitive edge compared to other parts of the world. The measures taken risks leading us in the wrong direction, subsidies, interventions of various sorts. So here one has to be very careful. The National Board of Trade has come up with one idea which we think would be worth trying, and that is to introduce a new means of decentralized enforcement on the internal market for services directive, for directives concerning mutual recognition, and some other directives where there is presently no national obligation to observe the enforcement of these rules, as there are for data protection in competition and intellectual property, for instance. So that's an idea that we have. We'll see if it will be taken up. And it will, of course, be important for the EU to do what Cecilia also alluded to, continue build competitiveness through openness of trade. And here we have a number of trade agreements that are presently underway or that are already negotiated but not yet implemented, such as the agreement with Mercosur, important, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And we are modernizing the agreements with Chile and Mexico. That will also be important. Negotiating new agreements with Australia, important not least for raw materials, Indonesia, India, difficult, but the negotiation is there. And there are also proposals, and the Commission is thinking of maybe coming back to dormant negotiations with Thailand and Malaysia. And all this, of course, would be completely in Claes-Göran Alvstam's part of it, in his legacy, since we are looking at Southeast Asia very clearly in this regard. We also, from the National Board of Trade, have a proposal for how the EU could link up better with the countries in the organization, which has the acronym that is almost impossible to use, CPTPP, the countries around the Pacific, through wider use of rules of origin, and I can come back to that as well if there is an interest. Now, lots of problems. These problems will all be fixed through a conference that the National Board of Trade plans to hold the 11th of May during the Swedish presidency. It will be the first Heckscher Ohlin conference in Stockholm, looking at what modern trade theory says about gains from trade and what that means for policy making. Our motto is make trade policy evidence-based again. You are all invited to come to this conference. You find information on it on our webpage. And that terrible guy has now been talking for too long. Thank you so much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Anders, and thank you for this positive last note that we are actually going forward to speak about how could we renew the international trading system. So thank you very much for the invitation. I guess there will be a lot of guests in Stockholm. And with that said, I welcome Petros Mavridis to the stage. Please, Petros.
Okej. Tack så mycket för inbjudan, Per. Jag kommer att tala engelska eftersom det finns folk här som inte talar svenska, nej? Okay, I'll speak in English since you don't all speak Swedish, which is not what I came here to do, but I'm very happy to participate in this conference. And Arthur was a big man, but Sweden has had a huge tradition in international trade. And it's in safe hands. A very dear friend of mine who is present here, Sten Håkan Nordström, wrote recently the best piece I've seen on climate change. So trade theory in Sweden, it's for a number of generations now. Sweden is in the forefront of theory. It's not something new. So I feel at home every time I come here to speak about trade, and I feel less and less at home in New York, where things, as I'll try to explain, they feel very different. Now, this is my main argument, and you might think that I had a cartel type of agreement with Cecilia, because you'll hear more or less the same thing with a twist. But we didn't speak before, although the take is very similar. To say that the WTO is in crisis, quite frankly, is bring coal to Newcastle. I mean, we know this for a few years now. But what is worrying me is not that the WTO is in crisis or that there are no solutions exist. The problem is there is no political will. No one wants to take the lead to enforce those solutions. And this is where I see the problem. We can solve intellectually the issues, but it's very difficult to solve the vacuum of political leadership. So, to me, the big question is the US-China relationship. If we don't find a solution to this issue, I don't see how the WTO can ever take off again. And where it will be resolved, in my view, matters, and I'll explain why, if it is within the WTO or outside the WTO. But one thing that I would urge policymakers to keep in mind is the cost of non-WTO, the point that Cecilia already made, and I will come back into this in a moment. Now, I want to start from MC12 last June, because it was hailed as a major success, and probably there are good arguments why this was the case. But in my view, a more realistic account is that the MC12 is an inventory for future action. It's not a success. And fishery subsidies, quite frankly, when you read it, there are 20,000 holes. How do we guarantee, implement monitoring, surveillance? And these things have not even been discussed. And the twin crises were not even touched. Adjudication is half past dead. If you look at the numbers, we have more and more WTO members, more and more agreements, and less disputes. 24 point something average up to 2019, less than 5 ever since, because the appellate body is in abeyance. But this is, as I will explain, to me, the easy problem to solve. The bigger problem is legislation. How on earth can we legislate between heterogeneous players, 164 of them? This is the big issue to me, and unless we rethink the WTO decision-making process, I cannot see how we can resolve this problem. Now, MC12 comes, it says, okay, here is what we should be doing in the near future. But what I see now is emerging is a Christmas tree type of list. Everybody comes up with an idea. There is no prioritization. There is no discussion. It's two ships passing by in the night and don't see any progress since last summer. Having said that, if there is a silver lining, in my view, this is it. It's good that we have twin crises, because if we have the legislative crisis and the judiciary continues to be performant, people might get the wrong incentives to submit to judges issues they cannot resolve in the negotiating table. And that has been bad in the WTO in the past, during the Uruguay round. Anders, who is 25 years older than me, should remember. It could be even worse now in the WTO with more agreements and more gaps. Now, why the crisis matters? Somebody might say, well, crisis, so what? So what? Now, what is the so what? The so what is, it's not that we don't have appetite for trade agreements. There is appetite. There is a fantastic World Bank study, 2020. You must have seen it. Michele Ruta was the lead economist, where they go through agreements signed post-1995, free trade areas. And then they check the amount of trade within what they call deep trade areas and other free trade areas. And you see thin borders across the way they qualify deep trade areas and thicker borders within MFN trade. That's why it matters. Trade has left Geneva, and now trade is hubs and spokes. Hubs could be Europe and someone, could be China and someone. US doesn't have much appetite for now, but could be the US. And this is the big issue. We left the multilateral forum to its unfortunate future. There are huge gaps as we speak, and the subsidies agreement is totally outdated. It was discussed in 1990, between 1992 and 93, when the Clinton administration came to power. There was no progress before. And it was discussed at a moment where there were no global value chains. As a result, transboundary subsidies cannot be punished. The European Union, in my view, does something totally illegal, and it will pay the price soon. But it does it out of necessity, because there is absolutely no way you can punish transboundary subsidies otherwise. National security, quite frankly, when you read the text is the reality of the 1940s. They had in mind war, and now we live in a world of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, and so on and so forth. There is nothing about export licensing. When you look at the world today, there is one export license after the other, after the other, after the other, issued by all and sundry, and we have no agreement on export license. And so on, as rules of origin has never been discussed. It's a mess. Now, what could be done about it? As I said, and I will go very briefly through this because this is not the important part, solutions exist. It's not that solutions don't exist. And I think, in my view, for whatever my view is worth, resolving the judicial crisis is the easy part. I was never a big fan of the appellate body, I have to confess, but I am a huge fan of compulsory third-party adjudication. So if there is a trade-off, in my view, and for the US to save face, because they have to save face, they cannot go back home saying, I get nothing out of the negotiation. One way for the US to save face is to say, okay, no appellate body, but the judges decide the decisions. The WTO members do not have control over the final outcome. Now, this, in my view, is what should be the aim, especially of the European Union, which has a lot to gain. If there is a trade-off, go for this. We cannot go back to 1995. It's impossible. The rest is simple. I mean, things like have one time, I prefer professional judges. I never understood why the European Union stopped arguing in favor of professional judges. What do they like the current situation where you have part-timers dealing with national security and writing reports that nobody understands to start with? But even if you do understand, and it's my job to understand, as much as I can, of course, they don't make sense. They say black, white, and gray on the second, give you 20 examples like this. Now, the difficult part is here. What do we do? How can we legislate at the WTO level? And to me, the key sentence is my second bullet point. When you deepen obligations and you enlarge the membership, this is a zero-sum game. You cannot go for deep obligations with heterogeneous players. It doesn't work. And unfortunately, this is the world where we are now. It is one thing to negotiate tariffs. Anyone can negotiate tariffs. You can have Sweden, one of the wealthiest countries on the one hand, and Senegal on the other, and negotiate on tariffs. But how can you negotiate environmental policy with Senegal? Senegal, it's not because they don't like, they love environment. I'm sure they would like to protect the environment. But they have bigger fish to fry there. They're not going to start from climate change. Unless if you have some like-mindedness, it is impossible to sit down and negotiate meaningful texts. You cannot do it on non-discrimination, because if you say non-discrimination, Senegal will never export anything to Sweden, because it will never meet the Swedish standards. So you have to go beyond that. But to go beyond that, you need like-mindedness. And that's what we don't have in the WTO. And to me, it's not paradoxical that consensus has become something like a veto in the WTO. You mentioned before India and South Africa. Well, India and South Africa, yes, they are the most vocal, but I can give you a number of examples from other countries in dozens of committees where they raise their hand, they say, I'm sorry, I'm not part of this consensus. Now, a few years back, with another Swedish economist who was Håkan's PhD advisor, Henrik Horn, we sat down and we checked all free trade agreements, and Andres Sapir, 3 people, all free trade agreements signed by the EU and the US. And for whatever our opinion is worth, we divided between, let's say, deep, I had a different term ourselves, deep trade areas and free trade areas. The ambitious, let's say, free trade areas were consistently between like-minded players. We didn't find one agreement in practice, one where you could have a Sweden-Senegal example discussing environment. Sweden-Denmark, yes. Sweden-Canada, yes. But never Sweden, if we want to be intellectually honest. So either we open up to variable geometry and the WTO, and that's the solution in my view, or we continue seeing free trade areas one after the other. In fact, there is some promise now in the WTO. The joint statement initiatives are a little bit what I described. It's something like variable geometry. Those who share a particular issue, they meet, they discuss, and they come up with an agreement. I don't want to bother you with Annex 4. If you want, we can talk later. It's legalese. We don't, it's not very interesting. Now, this is what could be done, but the question is what can be done. And I start from the US only for one reason, because I don't see any other leader. Unfortunately, the European Union, post-Brexit, lost the one big voice in favor of international cooperation. There are countries like Sweden who carry the flag, but unfortunately for Sweden, it is just a few million people. It doesn't have the critical mass that the UK has. Now everything is between France and Germany. None of them was exactly what you would call traditionally free trade country with a tradition and so on and so forth. And this is where we are. On the other hand, the other candidate is China. You don't want China to be the leader in international trade, so the only one is the US. But when I look into the US, that's where I become very pessimistic. These two are my favorite political scientists in the US, Mark Destler and Diane Matz from University of Pennsylvania. They wrote, I think, the best, whatever, when you can never say the best except for ABBA, for example, in music. But if, in my view, these are the top political scientists, they saw the situation better than anyone else. And their work suggests to me one thing. The trade discourse has left the United States political scene. There is agreement between Republicans and Democrats to do nothing on trade. It's easy to say Trump got it wrong, and I wrote dozens of papers against his trade policy, but I don't see any change now, quite frankly. I don't see the discourse. I see a different discourse, but the policy has not been appended. All the initiatives by the Biden administration concern IPEF or IPEF-type agreements, and I haven't seen one initiative before the WTO. So the leader, the one natural leader, is missing. And Jeff Sachs had a paper yesterday, or the day before yesterday, how you can have a concert. I would like to see to believe it. I mean, how collective leadership. Now, no leader, of course, is not inconsequential, as I said, because this means no leader in the WTO, we go regional. And there is worse. And what is the worst? Now, let's go back in time for 1 minute and think of the time when Anders was negotiating for Sverige, the Uruguay round. The Berlin Wall had fallen. You mentioned Francis Fukuyama, who was a member of the Reagan administration, the George W. Bush administration. He was working with Baker, and he wrote this book, The End of History. I'm sure he regretted it. He did regret, actually, because within a few years he wrote another book saying, when I said end, I meant it in the Platonic sense, the objective and not the end. But everybody was convinced the liberal paradigm had won and everything. When I did my book with Andrés Sapir on China, we sat down and we checked the discussion in the European Parliament, European leaders, and also before the US Congress. And when you read those guys, you get crazy. I mean, everybody, or almost everybody, with few dissidents, were saying, not only China is becoming a free market, this is given, but it's becoming a liberal democracy. With President Xi Jinping, within a few years, we'll have the first elected parliament, and so on and so forth, a few years later. So this was the discussion then. Now look at a few years later. China hasn't transformed at all. And why should it transform? I mean, first, its model works. It can profit from export-led growth because thanks to WTO, it has access to all those markets. The Chinese people buy into output legitimacy to the extent that the system works. Who cares about fair elections and so on? And it's true that they moved something like, there's this economist in Syracuse University, Devashish Mitra, who has a very nice paper explaining how China moved something like 350 million people out of poverty within less than 1 generation. Russia has resumed its disruptive role, and if there were these people believing in due commerce, even Cordell Hull, one of the founders of the GATT, that through trade we become better people, I think now we can forget about it. There's a lot of evidence that this is not necessarily the case. And look at trade policy. I mean, Cecilia mentioned before national security. I checked myself independently a little bit what's going on with national security. One case in 48 years of GATT, one. 4 disputes in the WTO in the last 2 years, 253 notifications on measures taken on national security, on cyber warfare, the majority under the TBT committee, which gave rise to 42 disputes, and 239 measures before the Market Access Committee in the WTO on issues other than cyber warfare, which touch upon national security. Everything is national. I can give you some examples. You will not believe your ears. National security by blocking the imports of lobster or caviar or things like this. And of course, it's getting worse. I don't need to say anything more because Cecilia covered this point totally. GVCs are reshoring, and this is a huge cost for not only for business, but also for the labor forces in all those markets. When you reshore, you say, okay, I give work to my own people. For how long? Because if these were productive people, I would have never outsourced in the first place, no. And then there is a cost for the society and so on and so forth. So can this trend be reversed, or are we into Thucydides' trap? To me, this is the prerequisite. Solve the China problem. Well, again, when we did the book with André, we were Monday morning quarterbacks, and Monday morning quarterbacks have 20/20 hindsight. But quite frankly, the terms of accession of China are anything but satisfactory. I mean, you cannot just put 3 words there and expect to see a flurry of disputes to open up the Chinese market and reduce the role of state-owned and state-owned enterprises when you don't have even the term state-owned enterprise in the subsidies agreement to start with. Now, where we solve it matters. And quite frankly, I don't know what is the best. I mean, I can see the argument both ways. Solve it inside the WTO is, of course, a vote of confidence in the WTO. Solve it outside the WTO, you remove a huge burden from the WTO. But what I think is more or less clear is how to solve it. I mean, we have to address some tough questions, and essentially the role of the state in national economy. This is the question that we need to address with China. There are state-owned enterprises, I'll say just one word on this, in Europe as well, and in the US, fewer. It's not a Chinese privilege, but in Europe, state-owned enterprises have to observe European competition law. This thing is missing in China, totally. And this is the big, big problem. Now, I am one of the people, again with Henrik, who is one of my permanent co-authors, if not the permanent co-author. We wrote a paper a few years back saying there is no need for common competition rules. And I was telling to Henrik recently, I'll translate from Swedish, I said how stupid we were when we wrote this paper. We didn't see anywhere. I felt like a fool. We didn't see the China thing at all. The paper, of course, is 1997. It's just before China joined. But we didn't see it at all coming. Now I say I wish I could go back in time and rewrite this paper and say why we need to discuss competition law inside the WTO. Now, what if China says no? You know, China has two reasons to say no. It is doing well anyway this way, no? And it did not write the WTO law. The WTO law was written by the rest. China did not write one word. But China is an export-led growth model for now. It cannot rely on domestic consumption, and China cannot rely on regional agreements either. All board, one belt, one road is with countries like Pakistan and Africa. This is not what China cares about. China cares about Sweden, Finland, Denmark, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So there is bargaining power on the other side of the table. The question is, will they exercise it collectively, yes or no? And that's my point about political will. I will say just one thing, that's my last point, about the price of inaction. And this is the other area where I agree 100% with Cecilia. The problem for me is not, if you wish, I understand that we cannot be, let me put it this way, I can say we cannot be on the same page with China on everything. No, we cannot. But we have to have some channels open because we need China for a number of things. It's not just the global commons. Everybody says climate change. Yes, that's important. But smaller things as well. The FATF, the FATF agreements for addressing money laundering, terrorism, and so on. China is a party, and we care about this. We need China for Basel, for cooperation across financial institutions. We need China for a number of areas where you have externalities can become global in the speed of light. Now, we cannot ask from China to be part in all those initiatives, but then decouple from China on trade. So we have to keep some channels open. How many, that will be the question for politicians to solve. I told you what is my idea, discuss the role of state in national economy, and I will leave you with this, thanking again my dear friend Per for including me in this conference.
Thank you very much, Petros. Are there any direct questions to Petros before we take a recess? Hi. You're all longing for coffee. There will be coffee. And we have one for the chat.
Yeah.
Please.
That's actually regarding the role of the dollar as the main trading currency. If that is under threat due to changing shifts in the Saudi Arabia's petrodollar perspective and so on. So a quick thing on that, maybe?
It's very quick. It's a long discussion, but the very quick response, quick svara, is no. I don't think this is something immediate. I mean, so far the majority of transactions are still taking place in dollar. China has been trying for years to get renminbi become a global currency without much success so far.
Okay. Thank you very much. Coffee will be just across the hallway here, and we'll assemble here within half an hour again. Okay. And then we have a wide discussion. Okay, my friends. First of all, I would like to thank our presenters for excellent complementary presentations that gives a lot of food for thought and also for discussion. And just to start here, I think one recurrent theme in all your presentations. That was the erosion of the normativity of the multilateral order. And all of you were also relating to the importance to muster a political will to get the WTO up on track again. It is perhaps a little bit simple to just to say that lack of political will, because in order to muster political will, it must be perceived as relevant. Mm-hmm. And I think we should start there a little bit. I mean, we're discussing the EU as the only defender of the multilateral order today. But in order to get allies engaged, and most importantly the US, what requires to make the WTO relevant for other major actors today? Cecilia mentioned one thing, the linkage to green transition, the linkage to climate change or biodiversity. Petros came up with the idea of, instead of having a WTO which is malfunctioning and substituted by regional preferential agreements, we should have a WTO in a variable geometry. But I want you to reflect on this. What is needed, according to you, to make the WTO relevant? Because I guess that is the first precondition for mustering political will. So, Anders, will you start?
It's a very good question. I think Petros alluded to the difficulties we have in the WTO in the dispute settlement system. And if we are to have a plan for bringing the Americans back, if it is at all possible, I think it will be necessary to do a real rethink of the dispute settlement system. As I said, I sat through lengthy negotiations when the WTO rules were written on anti-dumping, for instance, which are key rules in this regard. And there were disagreements in the negotiations on how to interpret some of the provisions. And now, more recently, the dispute settlement system and the appellate body has found a verdict that goes against the US on precisely these matters that were then questioned. So maybe the dispute settlement system has gone a bit too far. Petros knows much more about this than I, but I think that is one thing we have to do. And here, those of us that like the present way the dispute settlement system is functioning might have to lower our ambitions a little bit. That's one element.
Cecilia.
Well, I think we need to do several things. To create that political will, you need political pressure as well, and that's maybe what you alluded to. And if you talk to business organizations in the US, but also some consumer organizations, they are sorry that the US is not engaging anymore. I saw some statistics, it's a couple of years old now, but of all the cases that has gone through the appellate body that US was involved with, they have won 86%. So it has been useful for them to discipline other countries. And for instance, when China, you said China is a good student, I think it was the word, which is true, because when China is sort of convicted, was convicted by the dispute settlement mechanism, they followed, you know, despite not having a police mechanism of enforcing it. But I think still the climate issue is probably the way through, because the EU and others have been complaining a lot about the IRA, but the US and others have been complaining about something that the EU is about to push through, which is called another acronym, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a kind of fee, tax mechanism on carbon to decrease the carbon footprint in dirty production of steel, aluminium, cement, some fertilizers. And it is considered to be a fee that you have to pay at the border if you want to export to China, to Europe, to level the playing field. Ideally, of course, this would not lead to trade disputes, but to a way to cooperate to tax carbon in some way, because everybody agrees that this is the way to address it. And if the WTO could come up with some sort of mechanism for mutual recognition of different systems, or at least some peace clause, not to punish countries who are trying to do the same thing with slightly different means, that would be something. Maybe this is a way to get the US on board, because they don't want to be punished by this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And they are discussing own systems of sort of putting a tax or a fee or reducing carbon in a slightly different way, but still it's the same goal. Maybe that's a way to get them on board. And that could also get China and others on board, to be very instrumental. This is a big problem we need to solve. WTO is best suited to solve it, potentially.
Could there be a direct linkage between the WTO system and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example?
Possibly, yeah. Why not?
Petros.
What you just said is exactly Jeff Sachs's paper 2 days ago, exactly what your last line. So Anders and Cecilia, they mentioned 2 ways to bring the US on board. One is through increased awareness of the US private sector, and the second is the global commons issue that we have to be part. And I think, to me, if I were the Swedish presidency, which I hope Sweden will understand that they should be, and appoint me there very soon, I would dream of Switzerland. Sweden is not very far.
No, they are confusion of flags.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I would add one thing. I mean, I would like to see the European Union be the middle kingdom. That is, instead of leading to lead, it cannot lead now, but what it can do is mobilize all but the US, be the power that will have a forum, not only between Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, this is obvious, but also countries like Brazil and India. And that's not my idea. I take it from Paul Tucker. I had the pleasure to be discussing to his book, Global Discord. And I think this makes perfect sense. Europe should mobilize those guys, if it can, and then go and tell the US, look, everyone agrees that this is the way forward. You have now a historical opportunity to lead this coalition or to stay at home. You decide. The reputation cost would be humongous for the US to let it pass by. And the US can always hide behind the idea that now we speak with 10 different voices. But if we speak with one, and that's where I see Europe's contribution, because Europe, and that's my last sentence, if you look, Anders, you should remember, especially you were negotiating the Euro go around. It was the European Union that managed to do the guts. It was always the middle power. When there was, for some reason, Europe manages to have this, what we call in French, le feu fédérateur, that is, managed to mobilize resources and has the trust of countries that the US cannot enjoy. That's what I would expect from Europe to do.
Okay, you have 4 months.
and I'm here. I'm not very far.
And I'm not in the government office.
And you got the conference. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
About Switzerland condition about exchange economic about the market in general in Switzerland due to Sweden in comparison with Sweden. If the exchange, how is the exchange between Sweden and Switzerland? I would know.
Switzerland is one of the biggest markets for the European Union, you should know, its size notwithstanding. And there are these agreements between Switzerland and the European Union where essentially Switzerland adopts all of European Union law without deciding it. So I don't think, I mean, this is not a problem, the Swiss-Swedish relations. The problems are elsewhere.
Over here. Okay, there. Please.
No, you have, for the people online, you need to use the mic. Yes.
I want to tell you that one of the main targets that United States adopted those measures that can affect world trade show that they are not working. The company from Taiwan that is producing best age semiconductors decided to keep the production of the best semi chips in Taiwan. So I think that the United States seems determined to address some strategic issues. So we just have to expect more creative pushes. I have, and one reason the company from Taiwan mentioned for not expanding in the United States with the best technology is that labor force in the United States make impossible for a business to be profitable. So it may be true or not, just a political, diplomatic answer, but friendly shores means not only United States and maybe European Union have to stress this. You have limited population resources, and you have to enlarge the circle of friendly shores. And it's very difficult to analyze trade. There are very some strategic businesses, and they have to be analyzed also, and it's very, very difficult.
Are there any question? Okay, more a comment. So I think we have a question over here.
So my question was,
There's a question.
do you agree with European Union trying to pursue United States in enlarging the circle?
For the European Union to include US in that large circle?
The United States mentioned friendly shores.
Yes.
Enlarge friendly shores outside United States.
Absolutely, and that was part of my criticism, that you have to, if you use that term, friendshoring, first of all, you need to define it, and you need to make it as big as possible, because you might have lots of good friends in countries that you don't automatically think of, and if you don't include them in that circle, we risk to have severe disturbances in global trade, which will affect the least developed countries the most. So absolutely, you need a broad circle of friends. Yeah, but there are different salaries in different countries. That's hard to come in. But the security argument of Taiwan being such a dominant player in producing semiconductors and Taiwan living under the shadow of Chinese threat is, of course, a strategic part of the decision to produce more semiconductors in Europe and in the US. And that's why they are heavily subsidizing this sector for billions of dollars and euros. And there will be a lot of semiconductors in the future. So probably they are maybe taking a bit too much of this. But of course, there's a very strong security argument.
Okay. You mentioned earlier, some of the speakers, the efforts in Africa, between the African states, to reach some kind of a common African market. It's a huge continent. I don't think that everyone here really understands how big it is and what the potential is in Africa. So my real question is, how does Europe defend its interests in Africa, or even better, increase or enhance its efforts for a better trade and also for influence? Because now we see that both Chinese and Russians are there, and when you read that, I don't at least feel comfortable. So what do you think? What are the prospects from the European Union side to mota Olle gränd, you say in Swedish, to enhance its
in English it is to enhance its role.
Okay, enhance its role. Well, absolutely. The efforts to integrate the African continent into one market is, of course, a huge project. But all but one, Western Sahara, depending on if you define it as a state or not, but all but them are engaged in this project. And there's a lot to do, just by simplifying the rules, cooperating in the customs area, rules of origin, and so on. And the EU has tried via regional trade agreements in Africa. Africa is divided into different regions that they have divided, to have regional trade agreements to support that integration by creating stepping stones that can be useful in the wider integration. When it comes to these technical things on facilitating, on mutual recognition, on standards, on customs forms, etc. And that, I think, should continue, but it's important that it is under that the African countries set the conditions for that in a way. There is this concern that China, via the Belt and Road project, for instance, have invested heavily in Africa. Russia is there as well. Lavrov was touring some of the African countries just a couple of weeks ago and has gained some sympathy. And this is, of course, again, a geopolitical problem that the EU and the US are facing. The EU and US have set up jointly, and each of them as well, something called Global Gateway, which is supposed to be a sort of counterbalance to the Belt and Road, to invest in a more sustainable and in a more sort of rule-based infrastructure in these countries. That hasn't led to much yet. There was a joint decision just before Christmas to invest in Kenya and in infrastructure in Kenya and in Jamaica. That's what we have seen so far. But this is, of course, a geopolitical tension and challenge that is huge in Europe and in the US. But Anders, you have...
Yeah, very briefly, just to add to this, we have, as you know now, a government that has for the first time a trade and development minister. And our new trade and development minister wants to make sure that trade policy and development assistance policy is integrated maybe more than it has before. And this gives also opportunities in this regard. I mentioned that we in the National Board of Trade also have development assistance activities. 2 examples. We have one trade academy. A couple of months ago, 20 colleagues from Africa were graduating from this academy, where we increase capacity to take part in trade policy negotiations and things like that. And we have concrete projects, including in Zambia, where we set up technical barriers to trade and standardization authorities within the Zambian government in cooperation with us, which is important. Small things, but step by step measures like this can also be of interest. These are Swedish measures. Yeah.
But this has also been the trend in the European Union to merge sort of development, trade, political cooperation to a much more strategic way to work with Africa and other third countries, of course.
Okay. Does it work? Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. Interesting to listen to. And this is more a comment to Professor Petrus. I saw on your slide saying that China is not transformed. Perhaps you should have added the way we wanted. I've been working and living in the country for quite some time, and that country, if any, has transformed quite a lot in the past 40 years, which again have affected world trade, not the least. But more important, and this relates to what we've been discussing, China is also transforming Asia. China is transforming trade in South America, India, not the least, the continents I've been traveling quite a lot in. Currently, back to what you were saying, we need to see action. If we don't see action now, there is no way we can integrate with China. There is no way we can change that country in directions toward being more similar to us in certain circumstances. I was at a seminar at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gave a seminar in China, worked at the embassy there for a few years. And it was all about China being such a big player in the global economy. 18% of global GDP, another 10 years from now, perhaps 22%. And that scared the hell out of all Swedish diplomats sitting there. But I asked the question, what about if we add, come back to your question again, the GDP, the total GDP of all democratic states. We can start by adding European Union, North America, most countries in South America, Japan, and so forth. That makes up easily 70% of global GDP. So it's about coordination. If we can coordinate our actions, not just talk, we can make things happen, then China needs to negotiate on slightly different terms than today. Trade diversion, according to Chinese transformation in Asia right now, will be 40% more than today, just 10 years from now. That's their goal. We need to attend to that. Yeah, that's a comment. Thank you.
So on the first point, I apologize, clumsy shorthand on my part. That's exactly the line we have in our book with Sapir. The line in our book is not only, and actually we go a little bit further than you, we say not only China did not transform the way we wanted to transform, we also say China never promised to transform the way we wanted. There was never any Chinese commitment to this effect. Exactly. Well, maybe we took it from your book. I'm not saying intellectual theft is going around for ages. On the second point, or the only thing I say is that's exactly my line. That's the role I want to see Anders undertake during the Swedish presidency.
Yes, this might be quite a big question, but I mean, you talked a lot about there being an absence of a political will in global institutions, such as the WTO, and also we see an emergence of like new cultures, new countries becoming strong economically and having more of a say in global institutions and stuff like that. And I wonder, because we can all probably agree on that, like peace, the climate, and world trade are super important and that they can be combined. But you also talk about changing the way the WTO, for instance, is organized and how conclusions come up. And I mean, all of these things are very big. The change is very big, and we need to do something now. And I wonder, with the change of the WTO and focusing on both trade and peace and climate, do you think that the time frame for changing the WTO and Europe trying to be competitive in the way that they position themselves in global institutions, do you think that the time frame for that aligns with the urgentness of the need for peace and for climate change, or to change the direction that we're going with climate change?
Big question, please.
Very big question and important. And the short answer is no. We don't have that time. And there is a sort of preliminary timetable to set up a timetable to work for reform in WTO, which is going to be hugely difficult, as Petros said. And the WTO cannot save all the problems. But the problem is that WTO is not the only international organization that is in trouble. I mean, the United Nations is there, but it is very weak. What has the United Nations done in the Ukraine? I mean, you know, it is unfortunately very weak. The only strong organization right now seems to be NATO, but G7, G20 are also weak and difficult to find solutions. So it is a general problem. So when we need multilateral solutions the most, the multilateral organizations are the weakest. So we are in a hurry, absolutely. But still, you know, you need to do what you can. I think the WTO on the short-term basis, you need to continue with agreeing on things where many countries can agree, but not all of them, what we call plurilateral agreements. And there are discussions ongoing there on digital trade, for instance. There are emerging quite a lot of discussions on connecting trade and environment in a more modern way. So bring in all the countries you can, and the others can come afterwards. You know, so that has been the problem. If you wait for everybody to agree, nothing happens. So continue that path, and that is also what the Secretary General, Dr. Ngozi of WTO, has said. Well, this is, you know, the short-term solution that might be the most efficient. So I think we should invest in that, trying to define a few things where a big alliance of friends and almost friends and like-minded, or at least willing countries could focus in the WTO context. And then reforming the whole global governance is, of course, a huge task, and I don't think we will solve this today. But you will solve that as well.
At the conference.
Yeah, but may I add on that? Because I think that is important. There is political will, we need that. But there is also a necessity to make sure that we can build political will. And Petros, you and Cecilia talked about the situation in the United States. I think make trade policy evidence-based, again, is key. We have to understand what trade is and what it does. Today, we listen to the present USTR saying that the trade agreements that we have agreed in the past haven't worked. And she's wrong, because they have worked. They have created the increased trade and prosperity. The difficulty in the US is that they have no mechanism for distributing the gains to the people that need it. And so we have to address this from the base again, and it will take time. Until we are there to have a better understanding of what trade is, we have to do what Cecilia just said.
Thank you. We have a question from the Zoom room.
Yes, that's right. We actually have a couple of questions. And one question is about trying to persuade the upside of free trade, since the political debate often is stuck in that people have felt marginalized and don't see the benefits. And how can we kickstart that? How can we facilitate that discussion? And I guess joining the policy side and the more trade-related aspects as such. So that's one issue. There are a couple of more. Should I take one more, or we take this one first?
Yeah.
Yep.
I could just refer to my previous answer. I think that's part of it. And we are glad to have this conference, the 11th of May, in cooperation with the Stockholm School of Business.
But I could also say that they are, I mean, we criticize the US a lot, and there seems to be a bipartisan agreement on this more worker-focused trade policy, which means no trade policy in that regard, and the being tough on China. But there are also individual voices, both in the Democrats and the Republicans, coming up now and saying that, you know, if the US wants to keep a global leadership role, we need to be much more engaged. We cannot only talk about it, we need to act. Now the whole world is running, you know, is running in different other directions, and we can't be there. The business sector is saying that our competitors in other countries have access to markets that we don't have through the EU-Japan agreement, for instance, or the CPTPP. That was actually the idea, was the US idea, to create a framework of countries of friends who would be strong vis-à-vis China. And now the US is not in there, but that is flourishing, and a lot of countries are applying to join. And I agree that the EU should try to join as well. So there are forces coming, and you need to engage with those in the US, but also in other countries.
We have a question up here.
Yes. Is it working? Yes. Yes. Okay. I would like to question a little bit the whole discussion regarding free trade and only these kind of positive consequences. I have been following several free trade agreements, especially the one with the European Union and Mexico, and of course NAFTA. And I can tell you there are many things which are negative regarding consequences of free trade and can link to free trade agreements. And that means also something which Cecilia mentions, that the growth of populism to the right of many of these groups that have been affected by free trade. And regarding concrete free trade agreements, I can tell you that, for example, the one that is being now discussed, the modernization of the free trade agreement between the EU and Mexico, has several negative facts for domestic politics, which are absolutely not questioned by European Union. We have a huge network of European organizations together with Mexican organizations trying to stop this modernization agreement because of these negative effects to many groups in the population. So I think that the whole discussion and dynamics that free trade has only positive consequences should be questioned and should be problematized in many ways.
Well, I negotiated that agreement, so you would expect me to defend it, and it hasn't entered into force yet. Obviously, I don't agree that it's a bad agreement. I think it's a good agreement because it modernizes the old one. And with this, we have a whole chapter on sustainability, on the importance to engage with indigenous people, well, it is kind of... there are mechanisms that you need to involve the civil society on a binding basis. Yes, they are legally binding. There are no fees that you can be obliged to pay because there are no police in this. But they are binding to discuss and involve the civil society. There's even a chapter on fighting corruption and trade, which the Mexicans have agreed to, which I think would make a difference. Mexico is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. There are provisions on labor standards. There are provisions on human rights standards when it comes to child labor and others. It doesn't solve all problems, and the benefits, once it enters into force, of course, need to be distributed in a fairer way. But that is not the task of the agreement. That's the task of national politicians to make sure that it triggers down via, national politics, taxes, income systems, social benefits, what have you. But that's the next step, so to say. So I really hope that the EU will ratify that agreement so that it will enter into force. And I think it is good for EU, and I think it's good for Mexico.
We have a question up there.
I have a question for all three panelists. It's a general one. Taking into consideration the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the perceived growing China threat, has this been the main drive in the securitization of trade? Or has this been a growing long-term problem that's now coming into light?
Has the pandemic been a catalyst for processes that were already underway?
Look, it's a very complicated question. First of all, it's a very, very complicated question. I'll tell you what I think, how I see the pandemic. If we want to be intellectually honest about the pandemic, no one was perfect. I don't need to remind you about German export controls on medicine stuff. Not to India or Brazil, to Italy, inside the European Union. I don't want to remind you also of discriminatory export restrictions. They gave to France and not to the UK because it did Brexit and so on and so forth. Everybody has skeletons in his or her cupboard. Now, to me, the pandemic, what it showed is exactly that we made a terrible mistake in the Uruguay round, with all due respect to my dear friend Anders, who I appreciate more than you can imagine. The mistake was we abandoned the recipe of the Tokyo round. During the Tokyo round, there was awareness that tariffs had become as practically, except for a few, Hendrik has a paper with Harry Flam, except for a few markets, a non-issue. So the question is, how do I now integrate the market with respect to behind the border? And this is what I was telling you before. People said, well, we cannot go at the same speed, everyone, because some things preferences are endogenous, and there are endowments. And so in light of the endowments, I shape my preferences. You cannot expect everyone to be at the same pace. So they adopted, in my view always, a very sensible approach, which was codes. If you want to sign, you come in, you sign. Those who want to go further, faster, without putting into question MFN rights with respect to what we signed, please do it. Then comes the Uruguay round. For whatever reasons, now we discussed them before, we abandoned this recipe. And all those areas that could have been addressed and could have probably solved the pandemic problems, like what do I do with export restrictions, how do I address competition issues, what do I do with government procurement, essentially they were not discussed because we had to find the lowest common denominator so that everybody could have signed the Uruguay round agreements. And if you look at the Uruguay round agreements, it is the lowest possible denominator. I'll say one last sentence. Cecilia was a commissioner in the European Union. She can tell you much better than me. Inside the European Union, where the distance between Sweden, let's say, and Denmark on the one hand, and Bulgaria and Romania, the poorest of the European Union members, is, let's say, 1 to 6 max per capita income. In the WTO, it is 1 to 50. Now, inside the European Union, you have enhanced cooperation. Those who want to go further, faster, they can do so with the opinion of the Commission, which is a neutral agent, by the way, and so on. And in the WTO, we don't. You have enhanced cooperation with a relatively homogeneous construct, the EU, and we gave it up during the Uruguay round for the WTO. And then I think so my answer is, in light of all of this, the pandemic revealed the wrong strategies of the past.
Yeah, well, you're right, of course, but I think it's also important, as I think Cecilia did in her first her presentation, look at what the system meant for for coming out of the pandemic, because it was, after all, despite these flaws and despite the difficulties at the origin of the pandemic, it was the system that helped us both produce and distribute the vaccine and the other safety gears that we needed during that pandemic.
True. But this is a compliment to what I said. I don't think it takes into...
No. It's very complex.
Yeah.
We have a question up here.
Thank you very much for excellent presentations and comments. You all seem to agree that the US is relatively passive now and is not taking leadership in the reform of the multilateral system. Would you care to say something about how you understand US strategy? Is there a US vision for how multilateral governance should look, or are they just disregarding the whole matter?
No, I don't think there is a US strategy on how it should work. We have talked to them a lot, and they have had criticisms on how the WTO is working. We were probably, the European Union and others were a bit late to respond to that. We sort of defended the system in absurdum in a way, and taking quite a lot of time before admitting, yes, there are flaws. We need to do that. But also now, when everybody agrees that, yes, we need to strengthen it and we need to sort of build a stronger system, it's hard to engage with the US because they criticize a lot and they have points that are totally valid. But then you come with, okay, so how do we solve it? We can do this, we can do this, we could maybe do this. What do you think? But they have not come up with any during the last 7-8 years that I have seen, at least something came last week, a proposal on how to actually strengthen the WTO, how to save the dispute settlement mechanism or build a new, stronger one. What they have been engaging on is to reach out to build alliances across the world, but based more on a security basis, IPEF, AUKUS, the Squad, the Five Eyes, all that, which is more focused on security, which has an anti-China element in it that is quite strong, but also on some wider elements on supply chains, yes, but it does not contain anything related to trade as we know it. That is a strategy as well, to choose that before. Maybe that will change, but in Geneva, nothing is coming from the US people around the ambassador there, and from USTR, nothing that I have seen either. So that seems to be their strategy right now. Have you seen any secret documents that I missed in Geneva? Under
my contacts notwithstanding, no. I'm 100% on this line of thinking. I want to say two things. The first is, I think an excellent, if you wish, anecdote underscoring what Cecilia just said is the attitude of Hillary Clinton when she was a candidate. Mm-hmm. The Obama administration, I think, had a very clever strategy. They understood that the China terms of accession were wrong, so they negotiated an agreement for China without China, the TPP. Ideal. I mean, it takes care of, on paper, each and every worry that by that time the EU, US, Canada had voiced. What does Hillary say when she realizes that this doesn't fly with the American public? No to TPP. I mean, this is clear evidence of absence of strategy within the same party. And to cut a long story short, then Trump went even worse, said this is but you didn't expect anything else when you have Peter Navarro at USTR and Bob Lighthizer. And then comes the Biden administration and now tries to differentiate. So IPEF, one way to look at IPEF is it's a halfway house between Trump's blatant decoupling, disengagement, and TPP. That's the optimistic way. But this is not strategy. This is how do I start thinking now about international trade again? If IPEF is an indication of things to come, which is a very optimistic scenario, then quite frankly, I don't expect much to come out of the US in the next 2 years before the elections. No. I don't.
Let's hear from the Zoom room.
Yes, there is one question I think that is very relevant to how Claes would look at international trade and the connection between different levels that I want to ask the panel, because I think that was one of the signature things with Claes, that he works on the macro level, but he also connected it to the corporate level, and how does it actually play out in the real life after the deals are done and negotiations being concluded. So here there is one question on FTAs, and that many businesses are not using FTAs due to complex regulations, and there is an underusage. We see that in the trade agreement with Japan, for instance, and so on. So how to facilitate that, how to engage and to utilize this potential on the different levels?
That's what you're trying to do.
We are. We have several reports on this on our website. So you're welcome to go there and look at them. What is needed, of course, is first of all knowledge. Make sure that everybody knows about the opportunities, and maybe we haven't been good enough on that. And then, of course, also to make sure that the rules are user-friendly, and often they are not when it comes to rules of origin and what have you. And here we have found that the agencies that are advising companies on tariff matters need to do more and better to engage with their customers to actually to produce more simple systems for making sure that trade is handled under the terms of the agreement. And that's part of the answer, I think.
And also, I mean, the bad side of having so many bilateral trade agreements, like the EU has, for instance, is that even if there is a common pattern and a skeleton that is rather similar in all the mandates, they deviate, of course. So there are always certain national considerations and offensive, defensive interests and so on, which is totally normal. But that, if you're a company trading with Vietnam, Canada, Japan, and Singapore, you have 4 different rules or set of rules, which is of course complicating it. Had we had it all within the WTO, it would have been the same, but that's not possible for the reasons we know. But what needs to be done is of course also a constant caretaking of the trade agreements, and I alluded to that in my introduction. So what does the EU need to do? You need to look at those agreements, see where they appear. This is not user-friendly, or this is outdated. So you need to constantly try to update them and make them more user-friendly, and be sure that you engage with companies to see what do they need, how can we facilitate, and build that. There are chapters for small and medium-sized companies in all, for instance, and they are, one website where you can access all the information. But you need to work with that on a constant basis.
Yes,
Please.
The process of globalization was very fast until 2015 or so. If you look at GDP, or the trade share of GDP, etc., started to stagnate already then, or foreign direct investment. And then came the crisis in COVID, Ukraine, etc. I think we need to sort of try to re-establish the system again, I guess. But it seems to be easier to do it in terms of increased trade. When it comes to foreign direct investment, is that going to be a parallel process there, or how is that going to work? I mean, we're trying to shut out the Chinese from some kind of investments. Are Volvo going to invest in China or in Asia anymore? Or it seems to be a harder bet to get that back, and that also should be related to what happened in the trade areas, I guess. So are these 2 things related, or how do you negotiate the part that deals with the foreign direct investment? Because that is also important if you want to build a sort of sustainable, peaceful, stable world in a sense.
I can say 2 things, and then Cecilia knows much more. I mean, I follow a little bit what happens in the US and CFIUS, the body overlooking, not a little bit, I have to follow actually every decision by CFIUS, the body overlooking foreign direct investment in the US. So I have an army of researchers who check every decision. It's clear that China has been shunned from a number of markets, will be shunned from the semiconductors market, which has been included across critical infrastructure now. So I don't think that if you should expect too much in the short run. I mean, we have imperfect information, of course, about the future, but in the short run, I don't expect too much openness in the U.S. toward Chinese investment. The good thing about investment, the opposite of trade, is that in investment, protection is post-establishment. So if I don't say you can come into my market and you're outside my market, I can keep you out forever. In trade, the only way I can keep you out is through national security. And that's where all hell breaks loose. Because we abuse national security, because we have to accept everybody, and we end up where we end up. So the short answer is we end up in the same, let's say, more or less spot, but legally through investment, illegally through trade.
Yes, some trade agreements try to solve this. Some have chapters on it. The EU has also only investment agreements with some countries and try to negotiate one with China. It is done, but it's in the freezer because of sanctions vis-à-vis citizens on both sides. And there is an agreement, I think it is about to enter into force. The investment is a plurilateral agreement on investment facilitation, especially in developing countries, which is more technical than political. So it's concluded, right? But it hasn't entered into force yet. So there are a few things happening there. But what we have seen lately, that CFIUS, the body that regulates foreign investments in the US, has been copied in several other countries and strengthened. The EU has set up an investment screening mechanism, which is coordinating. The Swedish Riksdag just adopted the Swedish law to have a national one. There is one in Canada, in Australia, in Japan. China has a lot of investment screening as well. But of course, there the argument, as you so rightly say, of national security comes in. That we want investments, absolutely, but there is a national security risk, not only from China, could be other countries as well. But when it comes to critical infrastructure, some information systems, and so on, where then the country could say no, because we know that some investments from some countries comes with a political price. But of course, we would need ideally much more international cooperation on this to set joint standards and to promote and facilitate. But that's a long way to go.
I might add that the Swedish system for investment screening is about to be set up, as Cecilia said. And we will have the equivalent to CFIUS in our inspection for strategical products, ISP, who are going to have the power to decide on whether a specific investment is threatening our security or not. And in addition to that, a number of agencies will be giving advice to ISP on this, including the National Board of Trade. And our role will be to look at the economic consequences of a given investment.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all for organizing this today in the memory of Claes. I think many of us are very happy that we get to think about him the whole day and maybe the whole weekend after this. And I know he appreciated all of you very much. As a new PhD student, one of his PhD students doing work on gender and international trade, the first thing Claes says, you have to talk to Anders. You have to talk to Anders. So I'm sure he's with us and also very happy about this panel. So Claes loved, obviously, free trade agreements and free trade statistics in an almost absurd way. But he also liked a good argument, a good informed conversation and argument. So in his spirit, I will now ask a fairly critical question. Still taking protection behind him. No, but one of the things, and it relates to the question asked by Edma earlier about there is a lot of valid, I would say, critique from NGOs, from human rights organizations and so on, and in public debates around these issues of the effect of trade, but also the more moral political question. Cecilia raised it earlier, should we trade with China? We have Myanmar, a lot of critique coming of export to Myanmar. We have Yemen. We have a lot of different crises going on. And then the response that these organizations often get is, yes, but we have a social clause, right? In these agreements, we want to trade in a sustainable way. And let's face it, maybe the evidence of these social clauses being very revolutionary of global injustice is at best mediocre, I would say. And of course, this is due to the fact that we have this inevitable conflict between promoting economic interests and the sort of moral, political ideas around justice, freedom, anti-slavery, and so on. And sometimes I have the feeling that should we just stop having this conversation in this way, because we only sit down in trenches and go, yeah, but we have social causes and we need to defend free trade, and the others going, capitalism sucks, right? And in that conversation, nothing happens. So I'm wondering, is there an opening, a possibility to actually have a proper, solid conversation about how human rights feature in trade policy and in economic policy more broadly, of course?
Well, I would argue that we are on that track as well. When I came to Brussels to become trade commissioner, I had just spent 5 years in migration and organized crime, which is tough and sensitive, and lots of conflicts and lots of emotions, and you meet people who have suffered immensely. And then you came to trade and said, trade, that's easy. You trade with people, you do an agreement, who can be against? Ha! The first 2 weeks outside my office, for those of you who've been in Brussels, on Place Schumann, there were huge demonstrations, huge, tens of thousands of people, with posters, with all these acronyms that we talked about today that they were against, CETA, TTIP, ISDS, and what have you. I said, okay, we need to, how do we deal with this now? And so we quite immediately realized that we need to have that conversation about trade. This was just after the economic crisis. There was a fear that only the big companies would get advantages, that we would have standards imposed on us that would threaten environmental standards, consumer standards, and so on. So we started to engage with those people, inviting them into the room. Okay, so what's the problem? How can we talk about this? And of course, not to the full extent that some of them would have wishes, but actually we did change. There was a paradigm change in the way EU does trade by including clauses, not only social clauses, but actual references to legally binding United Nations standards, agreements, and conventions in environment, in labor, referring to the 8 labor core conventions of ILO. And ILO worked very closely with us on this, and on human rights, especially those related to trade when it comes to child labor, and so on. And we worked with the labor organizations, with the consumers organizations, with the environmental organizations, and set up a system of constant dialogue, establishing an advisory council, not with all of them, of course, but with representatives that would have insights and inputs on all trade agreements, making, talk to us what you think is important, this is what we're doing, and having that dialogue. And I would say that changed quite a lot. There hasn't been any big demonstrations since, actually, on these issues. It didn't solve all the problems, absolutely not, because, again, you need to talk about trade domestically and what you do with that. And there could be interest that you don't manage to protect in the trade agreement, but that you could nationally make sure that you address these problems as well. And you can't, if you don't have WTO functioning, you can have clauses that are compulsory to follow, in the way that if there are abuses, you set up a system with a representative of civil society on both sides, and you go through what's happening. And with peer pressure, with name and shame, you can actually make countries move. Vietnam is not at all a democracy. I wouldn't claim that. But they have acceded to some ILO conventions, thanks to pressure from the EU. Same with Japan, same with Peru, same with Ecuador, same with Georgia. And, so there are things to do. The only case that we have where actually someone has taken a country to court for violating is US Guatemala. That took 15 years. Everybody knew that Guatemala was violating heavily the human rights and labor rights, but you couldn't prove it. You couldn't prove it that it was related to trade, so the US lost that case. So, having discussions and involving civil society and putting pressure is probably, and that has also been proven by quite a lot of research, probably a better, not an ideal, but a better way. So I think we should have that discussion all the time. By the way, in Mexico, there's also an agreement, there's also a chapter I mentioned on animal rights. Yes, there is. I mean, you can't make them, you can't send the police to arrest people if they don't comply with the trade agreement. They are binding in the way that countries commit. And that's the only way we know in international politics.
No, I think what Cecilia did in the Commission is very important still. And in Gothenburg, we all recall, of course, what's happened here in 2001, which was also part of this, showed why this is so important. And just one additional piece. I think it's important to have a proper, again, back to basis discussion of the limits of trade, the limits of trade policy, the limits of trade agreements, and have that limit very clear in order to work out where do we need to link trade in an intelligent way to other agreements, other bodies of rules and regulations. And that discussion is often not very clear, and that contributes, I think, to the difficulties that you alluded to in your important question.
I'm slightly more nuanced about this. To me, the first question is, what is moral? I'll give you an example. There was a case between India, Pakistan, and Europe a few years back, never saw the light of day, concerning fair labor standards and child labor. And then I was reading, my wife is of Indian origin, Swiss, of course. I was reading the World Bank study about what is the average distance that children have to, at the time our kids were, this is 20 years ago, our kids were going to primary school, have to walk every day or take the bus to go to school. In Switzerland, it is, you know how much it is in Switzerland? Now, this is 25 years ago. Huh? It was something like 380 meters. You know what was in India?
20 kilometers?
26 kilometers. So I was asking myself, what is moral here? To say, I stop importing footballs made by children in Gujarat, or to allow those footballs so India has more money to spend on social policies. That's example number one. Where I am nuanced, I honestly don't know, I cannot tell you. I mean, I'm nuanced. I can see the argument both ways, or I would rather see India build the schools, or Sweden or Switzerland build those, instead of putting barriers to trade. Build those schools in India, and then kids will go to schools. Because that's the first best response, if you want to follow targeting literature here. But the second one, where I'm not nuanced, is the following. In 1989, there's the Tiananmen incident. They move into a square and they kill a few thousand Chinese. We never found out how many. At the same time, there is a negotiation concerning accession of China to the WTO. You know for how long they stopped negotiating? For 3 weeks. Yeah. 3 weeks later, they were back to the drawing table and they were negotiating with murderers. I mean, this type of human rights, and this is, I think, the problem of the human rights community, that they have not made these clear distinctions clearer to the trade people. That there are some no-nos where we should all agree, and there are areas where we can reasonably disagree, and I can accept divergence of views.
But there is also, and you didn't use the word, but you touched upon it, so sorry if I overinterpret, but there is, of course, an element of hypocrisy in this, absolutely. Yeah. It is much more easy to criticize Cambodia and Zimbabwe than China. Exactly. For geopolitical reasons. And why China EU has imposed sanctions on Cambodia, but not on Myanmar. I proposed it for 5 years, but that was stopped by member states for geopolitical reasons. We need to keep talking with the junta and so on. So there's a lot of politics in this as well, of course. And it's always easier to bash a smaller country than a bigger one.
I think we have to turn to the Zoom room.
Yes, there is a slightly more technical question maybe, but it's on the comment that you made, Cecilia, on the growth of the service industry and importance, particularly after COVID, with the increase of digital services, e-commerce and so on. So how do you see this? And I guess this is for the whole panel. How do you see service trade being regulated, facilitated and promoted as part of the globalization that we see coming?
There's a big vacuum and a big, long to-do list there, because it is growing, both in the way that we have ordered commodities online, but that can be dealt with the normal way. And then, of course, all the digital services that we are buying, streaming services and what have you. And there is a huge lack of international common standards, of interoperability in the systems, of agreement on how to measure, on how to classify, and so on. And this is really a problem. There is this negotiation within the WTO on e-commerce, trying to find a few steps forward. They are discussing, for instance, on what is an e-contract, and to have a global standard on this, which would be important, but still not enough. So there's a lot to do that. And there's also a problem even between countries, between the EU and the US, where they are discussing this. So lots to do in that new technology. And so far, the EU has been very good at regulating the problematic side when it comes to personal data, which is good. But the other side, on how to promote it as well, there's a lack of initiatives, unfortunately.
We have a question here.
Thank you. My name is Ellen Efterstöl. I'm a professor of civil law, not international law. I want to thank you for a super interesting morning here. It has been both entertaining and enlightening. I have learned a lot, and China, the US, the EU, big players. But all the time I've been waiting, when will they mention Russia? Only in relation to the Ukraine, but perspectives for the future. I would really love to hear some comments on that.
You're the Russia expert.
No, but it's of course a very good question.
You live in Finland.
Yeah.
We're next door.
And it's impossible today, I think, to map out properly what future we're going to have with Russia under these circumstances. But and that is a positive scenario. When this war ends, question, how do you end a war with a nuclear power? But when this war ends, it will be necessary, of course, again to start picking up links to Russia. That will probably mean that there will be a new regime under this positive scenario in Moscow. And step by step, it will be necessary again to come back to the kind of strategy that we have had with Russia before the war, starting with people-to-people contacts. If there are organizations building up again, let companies come back, and then back to the drawing board in terms of trade relations. But that is, of course, in a positive future scenario. Who knows when it starts, if it ever starts, but I'm not the expert.
I think nobody really knows. But with the current regime, I don't think it's possible. And what we see now, Russia is a neighbor, and we have a lot in common historically, but also hopefully in the future. But with an increasingly revanchist, authoritarian Russia, it is very hard to establish peaceful relations, even if the war stops. So there has to be, the wounds will take time to heal. So on a long-term basis, I hope so. But I don't see it happening on a short-term or a medium-term basis, unfortunately.
Time is rushing, and we have one last question. I've been trying to be very fair to keep in order, and but we have to draw a line here. So the last question, please, there.
Thank you all. I greatly enjoyed your presentations and the conversations. My question is in the same spirit as one of the previous comments here, so I would like to push back a little bit, or just to ask something. So if I understand the spirit of your presentations and your cases, you make a clear case for free trade. Growth is the ultimate end, and all the benefits that follow it, with poverty reduction and so forth. And security concerns, national security, they are at best obstacles that we need to navigate around in order to get this right. And I wonder, do the United States and China have the same ultimate goals that we do? And is our main task to be a broker for more free trade? I'm thinking of the historian Paul Kennedy, where he focused on the relative strength rather than the level of prosperity. So I can imagine that the United States would be, fairly okay with a loss if the China lose even more. Mm. Yeah. So the ultimate goal is power rather than economic growth. And we seem to be fostering economic growth or pursuing that. Do we have the right goal? And can we come to some, ultimate general equilibrium when we have such different approaches to it? So what we have done with free trade so far, where has it gotten us? We have a model where we import cheap energy from Russia and hoping to access the Chinese market and we are in a position where we are extremely weak and extremely dependent on the US and their security surplus. If you could please react to that and associate freely. Thank you very much again.
Please.
Your topic.
In 30 seconds. This merits an whole seminar. It's a huge question. It's a very, very good question, but it's very, very hard to answer. Well, the EU or Europe sort of calls itself more of an economic giant and less a political dwarf in a way, because they have realized that you know, on economics we can compete. I mean, the EU has, through integration, become a very peaceful, economic, prosperous area of the world, but has never had the geopolitical clout that China or US and a few others have. This has changed a little bit. It's too early to evaluate yet, with the strong sanctions and the strong support for Ukraine, both when it comes to the immediate but also long-term integration approaches with Ukraine and the bigger neighborhood. And that is the model Europe knows. It knows it can never compete with China and the US when it comes to security influence. It can become a player, but it will have to be a smaller player. So the focus has been trying to be powerful through trade, through economic liaisons, through soft power, which was very much talked about a few years ago, but is still valid. So, and I think that's where it can compete. The EU doesn't have an army. The EU doesn't have, you know, it is the collection of 27 sometimes very divergent views. So it cannot aim to compete. It will have to do with this and try to also to promote soft values through economic and soft cooperation.
Anders, do you want?
No, I think you gave the answer that can be given in this short period of time. The EU is not playing this game on equal footing with the US and China, given that we are a union of 27.
So, thank you very much for your responses to the questions, bringing these issues a little bit further. Thank you, all of you in the audience that have participated. And just a final note, these questions that we have been discussing here today are immensely important issues that affect our common future. They are, to a large degree, complex issues, but they really deserve an intensive discussion. And I think one of the problems here, if we should make multilateralism relevant in the political discourse, it has to be an engaging political discourse that is much wider than academic seminars as we have here today. And I guess here we have all a responsibility. And this is also a type of issue where the demarcation line between opinions and statement of facts is very blurred. And as academicians, we really have to defend that demarcation line. So thank you once again for coming here and having this splendid discussion with us. I've learned a lot, and my brain has got some more wrinkles, which I will kind of turn off. And as a small token of our appreciation, I give you this book, which, well read, it transforms the corridors of the school into an art gallery. Thank you very much.